Listening to Bad Dog Agility, bringing you training tips, interviews, and news about the great sport of dog agility.
I'm Jennifer.
I'm Esteban.
And I'm Sarah, and this is episode 270.
Today's podcast is brought to you by hititboard.com and the new Teeter Teach It, an easy-to-use tool that controls the amount of tip on your teeter so you can introduce motion to your dog in a gradual way. Just in time for winter training, order one now to receive a free feeding tray. You can also get $25 off a Hit It board and $50 off the Move It. Go to hititboard.com to get the holiday 2020 promo codes. That's hititboard.com.
Today, we're going to be talking about wintertime training. We are well into winter now. I think some places of the country or of the world more than others. People are covered in snow. People are putting away equipment, and people are wondering what kind of agility training they can or should be doing during this time.
Obviously, this really depends on where you are and what the weather situation is like. And so this might not be the podcast for you, but if you live in one of those cold climates, we've been getting a lot of emails in the past week or two from people who want to know how they're going to get through the winter. What should they be focused on? And I think you have to answer two questions. Number one, what do you have access to? And number two, what are the needs for your particular dog? So let's address the first one there. What do you have access to?
Yeah, and I think here you want to be looking at what do you have access to at home? So what kind of space do you have at home? What kind of equipment do you have at home? Is that equipment indoors or outdoors? Do you have an indoor space where you can do some single obstacle work? Are there spaces that you can rent to supplement your training? Do you have classes that you can attend? Maybe you don't even normally attend class, but maybe during the winter months, you might want to enroll in a class if that's available in your area. But just, where are you going to get access to the equipment for agility?
So here in Ohio, we have a lot of our competitions and our training classes inside, but a lot of people that are training at home are using outdoor areas, fields, yards. And so what we see in the summer months is a decrease in class enrollment because they'll take, maybe one class a week, but then they can go home and supplement with what they're doing in their yard. But then we do see an increase in rentals and an increase in class enrollment in the winter months. So just this week, we had our first snowfall. Lots of schools canceled on Tuesday. Actually, it was quite a bit of snow. Ethan went sledding. He was very excited about that. So we do have people that will maybe try to get in 2 classes a week, or they'll get in a class. And now the demand for rentals is more significant. So I think even though, in Ohio, we compete inside. So outdoor agility isn't a thing for competitions. It very much is still the primary means of how people are training. Most people don't have access to a 60 by 80 or whatever area to do a lot of handling. They might have a garage that's heated, or they put mat down, or a little bit of space in their basement. So there definitely is a big shift in what people's demands are this time of the year. Again, at least here in Ohio, where we are starting to see, the snow, the cold weather, the dark in the morning and dark at night, and quite a bit of a shift in our training.
For our international audience, Ohio is practically Canada to us. It's way up in the northern central part of the United States. Texas, we're here in, possibly the most southern part of the United States, except for Florida. And so the wintertime, we actually get quite a bit of training done.
Yeah, it is our prime time for training because
it's the summer where we can't get a lot of work done.
Exactly.
Because it's simply too hot for the dogs and for the people as well.
But it's also a really good point that Jennifer made, that it's not just weather, it's the shortened days. So for people who train outside, there are fewer daylight hours. And if your field isn't
especially
lit,
if you're working.
Exactly. If you work and if your field isn't lit, that's one thing where we have run into problems is we have the beautiful weather in the winter, but no sunlight to do the training. And so we're still a little bit more constrained in the winter than other times.
Yeah, great point. All right, let's address the second issue, which is what are the needs of your dog? And so I think that's a question you need to think about, and it's going to be very different. So if you have a dog who's been competing for a couple of years, you can think of this as kind of a break. And I think this is a natural break that a lot of people use. Jennifer, when you look at big competitions, they seem to be mostly in the fall, mostly in the spring, and not too many in the dead of winter, kind of January, at least here in the United States. So how do you differentiate, I think, between your up and comers who maybe haven't debuted yet and your dogs that have been around the block for a few years?
It's interesting looking at the timing of big events, because this is something I've talked about with several other people, because AKC Nationals being right at the very end of winter, right? So late March. So us in the Midwest, we always talk about how we feel like we're going into it with such a disadvantage compared to, West Coast Californians, Floridians who are, as you mentioned, there in Texas, kind of coming off of your prime time. January and February is kind of a downtime. It's naturally when I let my dogs have a little bit of a break. And then all of a sudden, I'm trying to be ready for a national championship in the middle to late March. But I always kind of feel like it comes full circle, because then when you do look at the events in the fall, it's the opposite, right? So I'm coming off of July, August, September, which are great months for me going into USDA Nationals and UKI US Open, where it would be the opposite for them. As you mentioned, that's being very hard. So for my dogs, I tend to give them a break in kind of late December going into January. A lot of that having to do with the holidays as well. Staying busy between Thanksgiving, December. Ethan's out of school, so my schedule and ability to train is a little bit more limited. And then kind of mid-January picking back up. I will say that when I say break, it's mostly a agility break, not necessarily a complete and total break from from training, and making sure to keep them in shape and keep them in condition. I don't want to take all of January, part of February off, and then try to be ready in March for them to be in their prime. So the scheduling and that periodization of my training does really play a role in what I'm doing with them this time of year. So my younger dogs, I am still doing more active agility training. A lot of jump training that can be done with 1 or 2 jumps. Even though I do have access to a indoor training, I do tend to adjust my training a bit this time of year. But the seasoned dogs, the older dogs, I do tend to use this time to work more on their conditioning, keeping them in shape, getting them in shape, muscle tone, even looking at jumping, where the young dogs are learning how to jump and how to do the mechanics of what they need to. The older dogs know how to do it, but I'm making sure that the muscles stay in tune and the muscles stay in check for needing to do those types of things.
I think those are really great points. So you mentioned conditioning, and things like rear end awareness, I imagine, would fall into that category. And conditioning is a very important part of dog agility training. I'm totally with you on the breaks. The 2 breaks I have during the year are mostly, during the summer, where it's brutally hot and kind of you finished all your big events, all your tryout events, all your championship events. And the winter, like you said, for all of the same reasons. We have 2 kids and they're in school, and the holidays are a big deal, and the kids have time off, and very often it's family time. A lot of people travel, and they're maybe not trialing quite as much. So certainly on the conditioning side. But what about when people say, okay, now what are some concrete agility type things that we can do? And I kind of look at 3 big areas, and actually they're all very much related, because they don't depend on equipment or lots of space like actual running. And so the 3 areas are start lines, tables, and your end contact behaviors. So at least when you're first teaching stop contacts, this is for the dog walk, the A-frame, and the teeter. If you use a stop contact on the teeter, you can teach the end contact behavior, and it doesn't have to actually be on the equipment, right? So you might do it on a plank, on an elevated platform, on some stairs. And so those are things that don't require as much space, because you don't have necessarily a lot of motion coming into those things. And so those are things that you can work on. Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people, when they think of agility, they think about running agility, and they think about handling. And it is probably the most fun part of agility is handling and running with your dog. But I think if we took a poll, an anonymous poll, so that nobody has to put their name on it, and we asked everybody, how confident are you that your start line is 100% in all situations and you can get whatever lead out you need or want on course to give yourself the best possible start, right? And looked at the number of people that that feel like their start line needs no work. It's perfect, right? I think that number is relatively small. And so then here we have a period of time where you, even though you want to be doing the fun agility handling stuff, you can't. It is the perfect time to go and work on these behaviors that you need, that are important, that maybe aren't as fun for you, but we can work on making those more fun for you and your dog, but are things that you need. And when you get back to handling, are going to give you such an advantage so that your handling improves, not because you worked on handling, but because you have more confidence in the start. When things fall apart in the first couple of obstacles, things fall apart, right? Mm-hmm. And so having that really, really solid start can really make a huge difference in the entire run.
Mm-hmm. I think this applies both to your veteran and novice dogs, right? So your novice dogs are learning for the first time the importance of these behaviors. So let's say you're getting ready for a trial, you're going to debut in maybe February or March. You want to have that confidence that the dog's going to stay at the start line, that they're going to hit their contacts, right? And now's a good time to make sure that you're prepared. But if you've got the veteran and their behaviors kind of fell off a little bit there in the fall and they were missing some contacts and their start lines were getting a little pushy, this is a great time to invest in some retraining. So when you come back out in the spring, you're going to have better performances. All right. The other thing that I think is very neglected is this idea of attention, focus, motivation, drive. We can kind of take several of these related concepts, throw them all in one bucket and say, getting my dog ready to perform in the trial environment. And so when we talk about veterans, I think you're going to be talking about dogs who naturally struggle with this. Let's say that you have a dog, they've been doing agility for a couple of years, but they're much better at home than they are at trials, right? So this is a nice opportunity for you to work on and focus on some of these things. Let's say you're getting ready to debut a dog. This is something that you don't know how your dog is going to react in a trial, but maybe we can do something about that. Maybe there's a trial near you. Pick a day, several hours that you can go and invest, take your dog over there and get them in that environment, being outside of the trial site, having other dogs around in the distance, being in a place where there are going to be other competitors. And so this is also the time to focus on skills like tugging so that your dog can play in any environment. And it doesn't have to be tugging specifically, but you need your dog to be able to do, in my view, basic, simple behaviors, hand touches, nose touches, rolling over. What are some other things dogs do? Sits, downs, spins. These simple behaviors, you want to make sure that your dog can do them in many different places, not just at your house, right? So if you spend winter break and you want to invest in a little bit of dog training, I would try and take my dog to different places. Now, this is very difficult. One, because of the winter, certainly, but two, because of COVID, right? And the COVID, not just restrictions, but regardless of restrictions, you want to make sure that you're limiting your risks, right? That you're out there with a mask, that you're staying away from other people. But you don't need people coming up and petting your dog or standing right next to you or anything like that. There can be people just around, in the building. Maybe I think for us, for example, you can take your dog to Home Depot, right? Those kinds of places. And you can find a place where that there are people. It's this huge, big, strange building that actually strongly resembles many of the indoor facilities where we hold agility trials, right? The high ceilings, the echoing noises, the foot traffic. And without getting near any of those people, wearing your mask, you can do some things with your dog, right? So I think that's a good opportunity to work on some things and help prepare them for the environment trials a little bit better.
The one that's near us that's also good is the parking lot of a dog park. I actually live on a road that has a dog park about 2 miles down. And while I personally am not a fan of taking my dogs into the dog park, in order to create kind of that stimulation and that excitement of other dogs running around, people moving around, I have gone down there and just worked some of my attention and a little bit of focus there. So not using it to go in and run my dogs, but using that as practice for those types of things, because something like a Home Depot or a Lowe's, once you start that, maybe you get comfortable with the environment, you get comfortable with the people, and it's dogs that really set your dog off. That, going to something like a dog park is usually even better than a pet store. At a pet store, I find it very small and you get into an aisle and maybe that dog isn't well behaved. But if you go into a parking lot, you get the space and all the other people are taking their dogs into the fenced in area. Mm-hmm. They're not coming up to you in the parking lot. So it kind of gives you some distractions off in a distance to work through. So that's an option that's always worth throwing out there as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't really like taking my dogs into PetSmart type situations, but I do want them in situations where there are dogs, and that's a really great idea. The next thing that people should think about or might think about is working on your verbal cues. And so I think this depends a little bit on access to equipment. Jen, what kind of verbals might you do in a winter scenario?
Yeah, this is huge for me. And I'm really trying to put a stronger emphasis to my students on verbals, but verbals and verbals against motion. And I'm not even talking agility verbals at this point, but having your dog be able to respond to a verbal when the motion doesn't support it. So if we do think of an agility setting, this is the scenario where maybe you're falling behind, so your motion appears to be running straight at the front side of a jump, but you want your dog to kick out to the backside. You would be saying, your backside verbal when your motion doesn't support it. Or a dog walk tunnel discrimination where you need to fade to the right, but you need your dog to take the obstacle on the left. So when we talk about how do we apply this to winter training or kind of that living room, small space training, I'm just talking about a scenario of, can you walk a straight line? And while you're walking, tell your dog sit. And you continue to walk, no hand cue, no change in pace, no pause, and have your dog sit. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, the majority of the people is no. And maybe if they can do it with a sit or a down, can you ask your dog to spin left? Can you ask your dog to spin right? I try to encourage my students to have at least 6 non-body cued verbals by the time the dog hits a year. I don't really care what they are. The ones that I recommend are sit down, stand, spinning left, spinning right, and backing up. Those are the ones that I pick. And I like 6 because we do some games where we roll a dice and have to ask for a verbal. 6 works out well to match the sides of the dice. Stuff like sit down and stand. I mean, those verbals also come into play into my conditioning, right? Being able to get the dog to do a kickback stand from a sit or be able to do those behaviors on a fit bone. So it's really handy to have those. But, even just you're standing in your living room, your dog's staring at you, start jumping up and down or start doing jumping jacks or jogging in place. While you're doing these actions, ask them to do something that you otherwise view as a pretty strong verbal. So ask them to spin left or ask them to lie down. You would be shocked the number of dogs that look at the handler like they have 6 heads, as they're standing there doing jumping jacks, like, you want me to do what? Or they're so distracted by the motion that they cannot focus on the verbal. And then that's exactly what I see carry over to the agility ring. They are so distracted by the motion that they're not responding to the verbal. So if you can't walk through your living room and ask your dog to spin left without a change in motion, it's going to be difficult when you're running down a line of jumps going into a 15-foot U-shaped tunnel discrimination where your motion is equally supporting the left end and the right end, and you need your dog to come in and do the throttle entry. So there's a whole lot of direct correlation in my mind to verbals and verbals against motion or verbals against distraction, and the dog's understanding of that as we apply it over to agility.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And I think that the thing that people need to keep in mind is that people tend to want to kind of jump into the agility application. But if your dog can't do something, quote, as simple as a sit when you're walking, right? That is a way more a simple version of this compared to what we ask of them in agility. And so you just have to remind yourself that this work that you're doing that isn't directly agility is teaching your dog a lesson that will carry over. And at the very least, it lets you practice working through that with a behavior that you are a lot less emotionally invested in versus trying to get the same behavior on something much more complex in your beloved sport of dog agility.
Mm-hmm.
And tying that directly over to start lines, one of the things that I will often challenge my students or ask my students to do is, as they've led out and the dog's on the start line, ask for a variety of behaviors that aren't always the release to the jump. So the dog is in a sit, ask for a down. The dog is in a down, ask him to back up. Keeping the variety so that the dog does not anticipate the release to the jump. Well, if you can't even just away from agility, get verbals at 15, 20, 25 feet away, you're not going to be able to do them in front of agility equipment. So kind of going back to what you said, these things that we can train, start lines, verbals, they all kind of tie together. So can you work on over the next several months being able to ask for these behaviors, not just right in front of your dog, but 20 feet away, so that then when you get back out in agility, you can do a lead out. And, once you get out there, jump and a half away, ask for one of those behaviors. So it kind of all comes full circle on the verbals also tying in directly with start lines.
Mm-hmm. I think the last point to make is that it is okay to take a break. So we've made that point before on other podcasts. And I think this is a similar situation. There have been some winters where, I've taken a complete break from training, even up to 4 to 6 weeks, but usually I'll get at least 2 weeks off during the winter, typically around Christmas to New Year's. That's stretched to overlap it with family time, but breaks are okay. Your young dog, it's okay. You're going to just delay training or a debut by a few weeks. And for your veteran, they can probably use the mid-year break. I think it's perfectly okay to have 2 downtimes during the calendar year, after all your spring events during the summer. And then, again, during the winter, I think that's fine. A lot of sports, human sports, work that way. So I think it's something that makes a lot of sense. The other thing to think about is while you are on this break, while your dog's on this break from trialing and training, you don't necessarily have to be on a break. And so this is where online instruction is very helpful. So for example, our VIP members, right, they have access to run analyses where they see us break down other handlers' run, and map analyses. So you can look at trends, what's going on around the agility world, maybe a little bit less so this year, but it's a great opportunity to kind of sit down and think, well, where do I have deficits? Where do I need to get better? Kind of coming up with a plan. And oh, by the way, January 1st is right around the corner for everyone, right? And that's the big time for New Year's resolutions. Goal setting, right? And so this is the time to kind of take stock of what's going on. And none of that requires, 70-degree weather and an outdoor snow-free field. So you can do all of that now. A lot of your mental prep, your mental game stuff can happen right now, even though you're not training. And this is something people do in all sports at this time of year. All right. So let me summarize for everyone what we have talked about. You want to first think about what you have access to in terms of equipment, facilities. You want to think about your dog, what your dog needs. Are they a veteran? Are they an up-and-coming dog that's getting ready to debut? So you'll have different programs for those 2 dogs. Specific agility behaviors you can work on include start lines, tables, and end contact behaviors. You want to be thinking about conditioning your dog. It's a great time to do that. You also want to think about their attention, focus, drive, motivation. Those are all things, whether they need to tug in a distracting environment or take treats and food in a distracting environment. Those are things that are going to be very, very helpful when they get to the trial setting, especially for dogs that have not yet debuted. You also want to work on verbals. Verbals is a big point of emphasis, I think, worldwide, especially over the last couple of years. Jen's made it a point of emphasis for herself. I'm going to expand my own verbal cue repertoire for this next generation of puppies as well. And topping it off with, it's okay to take a break. And now's a good time to kind of review, plan for the next year. If you're going to be taking that break, or even if you're not taking a break, it's a good time to do that. But there are mental game type things that you can be working on during the winter.
And building on that idea of a break, I will also throw out there a little personal planning on my part. Winter's a great time if you have any procedures for the dogs. I have a spay and a dental scheduled.
Good one.
I have a spay and a dental scheduled on the week between Christmas and New Year's because it is a good downtime with the holiday and events. Or also, I had somebody who's thinking about switching foods, but was worried about like, what if their stomach doesn't go well and they have a competition or they have class? So that could also be something to think about. So not really super directly tied to agility, but thought I'd throw it out there. You have a dog that needs a dental or a spay or a neuter, or you've wanted to try something that a change in treats or diet that you were worried might mess them up. Now might be a great time for that too.
That's a great one because it happens for people too.
Oh yeah, I know. I was thinking that.
I'll tell you as a doctor, one of the times that everybody comes rushing into your office, end of the year.
That's right. You got to use that health insurance money and get your deductibles and all of that. All right, perfect. That is a great last point. And that is it for this week's podcast. We'd like to thank our sponsor, hititboard.com. Happy training.